Hi everyone, this is Fashion Knowledge and my name is Beata Wilczek. I am a Berlin-based critical fashion practitioner and I work across education, research and strategy. I lecture on fashion, design and digital cultures and I run a consultancy and research laboratory called Unfolding Strategies. In each episode, together with my students and fellow researchers and practitioners, we discuss the fashion's most urgent issues and try to reimagine the socially just, sustainable and digital fashion futures. Welcome everyone. Today our lovely guest is Noorin Khamisani, who is a designer, researcher, and educator from London, and who has been working with ethical fashion since 2009. Noorin is currently based in Dubai, where she joined DIDI, the Dubai Institute for Design and Innovation, where she teaches on sustainable fashion. Her practice is twofold, as apart from working with students and writing papers, she also runs Outsider, a fashion label focused on design for longevity. Noorin has an extremely versatile fashion design work experience, as she has worked with such experimental designers as Susan Cianciolo and such retailers as Ted Baker and Hobbs. Today, we will talk about Noorin's expertise in design for multiple lives, upcycling, and fashion design education. This last thing, design education, this is also what connected us last year when Noorin reached out to me on LinkedIn. We discovered that our interests in educations are connected and started a collaborative research initiative called Teaching Fashion Together. It is a space for collaborative research and conversations with fellow teachers. We both hope for more plurality in fashion education, but before we get to the point where we talk about what the future of fashion education will be, I would like to start from the beginning. So Noorin, my first question is, what is ethical fashion? How do you define it?
Oh, okay. Well, I think ultimately, whenever we're talking about this kind of terminology, so whether we're talking about ethical or sustainable and, the numerous terms that we have to kind of grapple with now, I mean, they're always umbrella terms, so I think it's quite complicated to have one definition. I think that they bring together a lot of different factors. And so depending on who's talking about it and the context within which we're talking about it, it can mean different things. For me personally, when I started, I started my business officially in 2009, but I started doing research before that. And at that time, I was, very much kind of working with high street retailers in the UK, and I was watching the kind of, and I was having to be part of these kind of interactions, for example, with factories in faraway countries. And I think this is a very natural thing that I experienced, that, over time, as I was watching these interactions, I just felt like, well, this is really wrong. Like, why are we asking for discounts when the factory's been flooded? Why are we, asking for discounts when this has gone wrong? Why are we, there was always this kind of interactions where no matter what the factory did, they had to pay for it and they were somehow responsible. And I just had this, realization that, here we are sitting in London having this very privileged life, and these people in these factories, we really have no idea what conditions they're working with, and it's just a constant bombardment of just it felt like I felt very uncomfortable. So for me, that was sort of the beginning of, okay, I want to be able to create fashion. I want to be able to work in the fashion industry and not be uncomfortable with the way that I'm interacting and working with people. I really believe that all human beings, we all have a right to decent work and to safe working conditions, and, to be paid a proper wage for that. And so this is really the starting point for me personally. And I think, if we're thinking about ethical fashion, it should be fashion that doesn't harm, people or animals or the planet ultimately. But as I said, it's very, very broad. But ideally, to not do any harm would be for me the most ethical approach. Although, I'm not sure if perfection is possible. But I think that's the dream.
Well, let's see. Let's discuss this maybe further. So, okay, so you come from this moment that you're a part of industry. You have this realization that it's very harmful. So I'm curious then, how do you react? And obviously this is the part when those topics get difficult because they're very pessimistic and it's suddenly saturating something that it's, painful, problematic, and so on. So what kind of sustainable or ethical strategies do you introduce in your own design practice? Like, what do you do to make it possible, bearable, doable, or ethical in
Yeah,
some ways?
yeah. So I mean, again, it came in sort of layers, So my first research was kind of around, okay, so, what does it mean if I want to design a fashion that is, sustainable and ethical? And I kind of mapped out what that meant for me, because certainly in the late 2000s, it wasn't as established as it is now. But I mean, even now, when you look at the brands, obviously there's so much variety. But for me, I'd always had this fascination with, the term we have now is design for longevity. But at that time, I just knew, even from when I did my final collection at university, I was really interested in garments that are timeless, that sort of have an essence of something, but you can't quite place them. And the designers that I really liked were the designers that worked in this way that wasn't necessarily so driven by seasons. It was sort of a slower development. I always found that more fascinating and more emotive. So that was really my starting point. It's kind of this realization of like, oh, this is actually the way I think fashion should be anyway. I think it should be slower. I think it should have a sort of timelessness to it. I think there's something quite magic about this idea of those pieces that are passed down maybe through families, those pieces that you've had for years, but every time you wear them, people are like, oh, is that new? Or where's that from? That's nice. I think there's this kind of magic in all those pieces. So that was kind of, from a creative perspective, that was my driver, as I was trying to design something that was timeless and not kind of trend driven. And then within that, working with fabrics that were as sustainable as possible. Again, when I first started, it was quite limited what I could access. So there was also this need to kind of spend a lot of time sourcing fabrics and then kind of designing really fabric led, because I couldn't just kind of go and pick, okay, I'll have this and this and this. I had to kind of go, okay, so as a small designer, I'm starting a range. I can probably buy 2 rolls of fabric. All right, so the whole collection's going to be made in this and this. So, but of course, I chose the most sustainable fabrics that I could. So at the time, I was using like a hemp silk and some linen and some organic cotton, and then that sort of evolved over the years. And then working with a factory that I felt comfortable spending time in, so making sure that it had good safe working conditions, that I could go and visit it, that I could see that people were working in a way that they were allowed to come and go. All these kinds of things. I think again, at scale, when you're working with a bigger company, you can have, say, audits and certifications and things, but as an independent designer, when you're first starting, and certainly what I did is I went on my gut and I went and spent time at the factory to see what it was like. So there were these kind of layers of, say, ethics, sustainable fabrics, and then design for longevity.
And do you think, because you said it's changed a lot in recent years, so what do you think there's now some certain new, I don't know, ways of doing things or certain parameters that young designers can apply to their work?
Well, I think there's a lot more scope and accessibility to just a much wider variety of fabrics now than ever before. I also think the sort of availability, for example, to source materials if you want to do like upcycling, or the infrastructure is improving. It still definitely needs work, but it's much more possible than it used to be to, say, be able to access a certain amount of excess garments and recreate them, or more reliable sources for kind of end of the line rolls of fabrics. And of course, there's also this really whole exciting area of biomaterials, and new kind of materials that as a designer, you can now have much more control over. So I think for me, that's one of the most exciting things within fashion practice, is the fact that we don't just have to be limited to buying or getting a finished fabric. We can actually create fabrics ourselves and have control in that way.
But can you imagine those strategies and those approaches to be being adapted on a mass scale? Like, are they universal, or are they only kind of small to medium?
I don't know. I mean, I guess for me personally, I'm not that interested in scale, so I don't necessarily think of that, when
Mm,
I'm thinking about what, what I'm interested in, I actually think that scale is the problem,
mhm.
and what we need is a lot less of these big companies and a lot more small independents. So that's, I guess, more, I would say, my interest, although I've worked for those big companies. But I mean, again, we're seeing loads of big brands are doing upcycling. I mean, Prada is doing upcycling, Levi's is doing upcycling. I mean, there's a massive resurgence of like re-commerce. um, so I think it absolutely can be done at scale, but I'm not sure if it's as good when it's done at scale, or as creative as when you see independent designers doing it in different places and in different ways.
Yeah, that's why I asked, because I find it so surprising that suddenly those kind of, I would say still a couple of years ago, niche sustainable strategies are suddenly like a thing. And there's the whole kind of brand identities now evolving around them as companies are trying to push sustainable efforts. And on the one hand, it's great that, in some ways that they're doing that, and many companies were also doing that before in order to save on materials. So it wasn't an accident that H&M group companies would have, I don't know, COS, for example, used to do that you would have one leather product, and then next season you would see a smaller one from the same color from the same leather, because it's obviously efficiency and you're saving materials. So there's a perfect, business logic to it. The same with selling your dead stock instead of, for example, as Barbary did in the past, burning it. So there are those ways of making
Mm.
those things work, but also at the same time claiming that they are sustainable. And I find them very fascinating. And I'm mesmerized that they're operating with such a mass scale. I'm just thinking, when is it same but different? Where is this kind of shift when is it like big companies chasing ethicality? But we don't have to go in this direction. Uh,
No, but
yeah.
I think it's a really relevant point, because I think, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's something to always consider, right? It's kind
Mm,
of that, of course, it's not like we don't want H&M to do something, because I mean, H&M is huge. So, if H&M improves their sustainability work, by 5%, that relates to, tens of thousands of units. So that's actually huge impact.
mm,
But the point is, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the damage they're doing, right? So
mm,
it's this really kind of uncomfortable space, I think, because you want them to do something, that's great, but do they deserve to get so much press for like this tiny thing, really, in the scheme of everything else? So yeah, I find it really difficult, and I still can't quite decide what I think. I still think it's better they do something,
mm,
but the point is that if you, on a sort of personal level, if you want to say, you know, um, think about consuming fashion in a more ethical way, then I think it's better to go to those independent designers that are probably creating the much more creative and exciting pieces that are going to be the things that you really want to keep and treasure for a long time, because there's a lot more meaning and I would say love that's gone into the creation of those things.
mm. And I would like to go back to upcycling. So how do you even explain to people what upcycling is? You also said before, design for longevity. Maybe this is also not clear for everyone. What does
Mm.
it mean? Because this is kind of imposing life and death into the life cycle again, very kind of humanizing, garments and products that surround us. So how do you particularly work with upcycling? What does it mean to you, and what it has to do with this long life, longevity, life and death of
Mm.
garments?
Well, so I mean, in general, we're talking more and more in fashion about, garment lifetimes, because there was a huge amount of research was done in the UK by RAP that showed that by increasing lifetimes, you know, even by, you know, 3 months, 6 months, the kind of reduce climate impact, you know. So it's really important for us to think differently about the way that, you know, we use resources ultimately. So if we can create things and then use them for longer, then we're reducing the need for, say, more new resources, right? We're using our resources in a better way, in very simplistic terms. So that's really where sort of design for longevity comes in. Is, you know, it's almost the opposite of fast fashion. So it's like slow fashion. So, you know, if you are creating a t-shirt, and, you know, in a sort of fast fashion system, a t-shirt would be designed and created to last 3 months. And, you know, in sort of design for longevity, you might be thinking about creating a t-shirt to last 3 years or 10 years, or, you know, whatever you want. But the whole idea is to create something that can have that extended life. And then that will relate to lots of things. That would be, say, the aesthetic of the design, the material you choose, you know, how you construct it. All these different factors will impact its success or failure. But yeah, the idea is to design something that can last a long time. But I also find it really interesting, and I guess this kind of goes back to what my original interest was even as a student, is kind of how do you design something like a fashion, you know, piece that someone wants to have that kind of long-term relationship with, because we've sort of been trained out of treasuring and keeping garments for a long time. So I find it really fascinating to design something to have that kind of long-term interaction with someone, and to have a long lifetime, either with one or multiple users. I also think that's, you know, really interesting.
Yeah, that leads to my next question. So I am always confused when I think about, you know, this kind of renting fashion model, and I know that you are that you know more than I do about it, and I'm interested what's your opinion, because on one hand there is this very emotive narrative behind, you know, human garment relationships, which is now going with digital fashion in a totally different direction, because this creates another way of, you know, ownership. But this is not our main subject today. Nevertheless, we have those intimate relationship with garments, and then also next to it is this idea of renting garments. So how does that, you know, how does kind of behavioral, emotional relationship with garments in terms of those sustainable scenarios, how does it play out?
Sorry, so what's your question about that specifically?
Yeah, so on one hand, you say that, you know, you particularly design for longevity, you design garments that are going to be worn, and that people who own them will have some relationships with them. So I imagine it very much as this kind of one-on-one relationship between human and a garment.
Yeah.
And then rental services are actually, for me, they are derived from this personal connection, this kind of element of co-ownership doesn't basically give me this emotive, you know, feeling.
Well, I guess it's also about having variety, right? Because I think that's one of the challenges, you know, especially as we're sort of trying to, say, transition people to more sort of sustainable behaviors with fashion. So, I mean, if you say to people, well, okay, everything you buy has to be something that you're going to wear a lot and you're going to keep for a long time, and you have to buy less. Okay, so I mean, for some people that's completely fine. For some people that's a massive relief, because they're like, oh, I can just wear like a uniform and that's brilliant. For other people, you know,
I like
they
that.
want, yeah, I mean, it's for some
I
people,
like
yeah, like
that
this whole
scenario.
minimalist capsule wardrobe, all that camp are like, yes, perfect, that's great. But of course, we have to, you know, think about the fact that there are many different types of fashion users and fashion lovers, and there's different reasons why we want fashion. So, you know, even for me, like, you know, I have my own brand. I have numerous dresses in my collection. But, you know, if I get invited to a party or a wedding, sometimes I might want to wear something else, right? But that doesn't mean that I want to buy something to wear. So I think this is the space where fashion rental has a real opportunity. So it could be you know, the sort of the more perhaps the more sort of fashion forward experimental pieces, maybe like a crazy sequin jumpsuit, something that you might want to wear just once, never again. You know, I think those kinds of things are so perfect in a kind of rental model where you can have still the fun of fashion. You can experiment with self-expression. You can experiment with, you know, how you want to be that week or for that particular event. So, you know, I think fashion rental has so much potential, and I think it could also be for more everyday garments for sure. But I think maybe initially there's a kind of re-education that needs to happen, because we do very much feel that our garments, you know, are ours, and they're sort of intimate because they are on our bodies. So certainly I think we need a bit of time, and it needs to be more widely available, and I think more convenient for it to grow. But I think that has massive potential, because I don't know, yeah, so I did a lot of research on this in my master's, and you know, I just remember having these conversations just with some of the girls in my masters, and we were just talking about how, you know, wouldn't it be so great on like a Friday night to like go to the fashion library, you know, get dressed up in your Friday night outfit from the rental, then go out in your rental outfit, you know, and it could very much become a part of the sort of social fabric, and become quite everyday. But it's just, it's not something we're used to. It feels kind of new to us, right? It's only
Mm.
really for sort of like costumes or like wedding rental that it's established. But I think in the same way that people have changed their you know, relationships with, I mean, you know, who buys CDs anymore? You know, you don't even need to own your car anymore, right? I mean, there's so many other avenues where we've become used to wanting access and not ownership. And I do think that this will happen with fashion, but maybe it's going to take like 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. The shared economy in fashion is something that is progressing very, very, very slowly. And there were many exciting projects of that sort, but somehow they, you know, they had to collapse. We have now a new one in Berlin that's kind of been going on, I think, for 6 months. It's called Pull. I'm very curious how it's gonna be and how it's gonna develop. Even though I'm a team uniform person and I don't see myself subscribing to it, but I think that already, you know, many companies such as Zalando, ASOS, that actually send many boxes back and forth. I think they also opened this outlet, this possibility for people to be able to rent out and resend. So I think this also actually created certain habits in consumers. But let's talk a little bit about education. What are you currently working on with your students? What are you doing at DIDI?
So we just finished our semester. But yeah, this past semester, I was working with a fashion studio course, and I had set the kind of project based on the research that I did on my master's. So they had to design for multiple lives. So they had to think about designing a jacket specifically, and then, you know, a full collection around that, but specifically thinking about how they could design a jacket that could have multiple lives. And then within that, we were also integrating an element where they had to create their own materiality. So some of them used 3D printing, some of them created biomaterials, different kinds of experiments kind of came out of that. And then, you know, they were thinking about, I don't know, some of them were designing for like a garment that could be shared between a husband and wife, or between a mother and daughter. Some of them were thinking about jackets that would have different elements that would come apart. So each part of the jacket would have a different life cycle. So I've been experimenting a lot with sort of thinking about different types of life cycles and materiality within fashion.
Yeah,
And yeah,
oh, sorry to interrupt
no,
you,
it's okay.
but I really like this kind of idea of creating garments that can be shared by different communities, group of
Mm.
people, I don't know, biological families, non-biological families. I think this is very, very interesting for kind of decentralizing, you know, experiencing and consuming fashion this way. So yeah, this is a great idea.
Mm.
I'm really looking now for more collaborative fashion design projects. So there is a collaborative authorship in fashion design. So I think actually consuming fashion collectively, maybe I also promote this idea, you know, of co-creating fashion in teams together, not only having this one grand designer
Mm.
figure. But that was just a side note. Please, you
No,
wanted.
but no, I was just going to say, but actually, yeah, so with this third year studio that I was teaching, they were all working in design duos. So they all had to actually design with another person and
Mhm.
work with another person on that. That was also very interesting to see how they had to kind of, you know, take their individual kind of design aesthetics and kind of merge it together and push that through. So yeah, I set them a lot of challenges, but they did a pretty good job.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I hope we will see more projects like this in future that kind of embrace this collaborative spirit. And I don't know, what was the project that gave you most satisfaction in this educational context?
So there was one duo that did this project where they were sort of looking at like an insect sort of ectoskeleton and how insects kind of shed their skin and then they sort of have this second life, and they were using that as kind of the starting point. And so they did some very interesting work where they, you know, created their own biomaterial using cactus, I think. And then they created these kind of skeletal sort of pieces using 3D printing, and then they were sort of embedded in this biomaterial. And they, I mean, I don't even know how they did it, because it's really not easy to create biomaterials that are so just so kind of flexible but also strong, you know. And they managed to like pleat this fabric and construct it into the garment. And yeah, so that was really, yeah, beautiful. And also they created a kind of fashion film to tell the story. So it was just a very successful and fully developed project. So that gave me a lot of joy, just to
Hmm.
see them kind of, yeah, go from something that I think was quite a big challenge, but they managed to take it through into something very much that was unique and surprising.
Yeah, that sounds like a beautiful project, but it also makes me think, you know, do you think that with such efforts, such as discussing sustainability and biomimicry and biomaterials, do you think that even in the next 10 years we'll be talking about it? Is it going to become a new normal, or this is always going to be this kind of pro-ecological, pro-ethical branch of designing and design education? So I don't know, maybe if we could
Mm.
like speculate, you know, let's imagine that we're sitting here 10 years from now, we're recording another podcast, it's 2031, and we're trying to discuss exciting, urgent, important things in fashion. Are we still talking about
Mm.
sustainability and biomimicry?
Well, we'll be well into the climate emergency by then. Or should we actually speak as if we are like, oh, it's really hot. It's really hot. I mean, I'm in Europe, but it's the same temperature it used to be in Dubai 10 years ago, you know? I mean, I do think we'll be in a very different setting. I think, I mean, maybe not in 10 years, maybe it'll take more than that. But of course, if we see the sort of warming occur, then we're not going to be able to, say, create the materials that we're used to now or at the scale that we're used to now. So I think, you know, it'll, you know, it could be potentially a situation like, you know, post-war, right, where we had rationing and where people can only access materials in certain ways. And so then it becomes really useful for all those designers that have had training to work with different types of materials and to work with different types of sources. And I mean, I know we actually, you asked me before, I didn't really get to it, but you know, you mentioned sort of upcycling. And, you know, I think that's something that's definitely going to be an essential skill for a fashion designer. And that's something I've worked with a second year group. And we actually had, you know, waste donated by a fashion brand that's just upstairs from our university. And we had to they had to transform whatever pile of waste they were allocated with. And, you know, I definitely think that that's something we're going to have to get very much used to in fashion practice, because we have huge amounts of textiles that are currently wasted, that are, you know, ending up in landfill. You know, all these big brands have warehouses full of garments that are unsold. So being able to, you know, design and create with, you know, existing garments rather than a roll of fabric, I think is going to be a really important skill, because I think it's inevitable.
Great. Thank you so much. There was a hint of optimism in this rather pessimistic scenario. I was secretly hoping that you will say that's going to become so common that actually we will not have to discuss sustainability and ethics because it's going to become a new normal. But that was more of a reality check. So yeah.
I don't know. I think I've been in this for over 10 years. So I'm like, it's taken 10 years just to get a lot of people talking about it. You know, when I first started my label, well, it's coming up to 12 years ago, and I was like, oh, it's an ethical fashion label. And everyone would be like, ethnic? And I was like, no, 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 that's something different. I was like, this is ethic. Okay, never mind. You know, so it's like, it's taken more than 10 years to get to the point where I think, you know, I'm sure you have as well with my students. Most of the students, if you say ethical fashion, sustainable fashion, they know something about it. They're used to that terminology. So it's taken 10 years to get to that point. So
I would even say it took more time. It took, actually, I would say if we are pinpointing it historically, that kind of started in the 60s. So, you know, if this is 50 years in the making, maybe next 10 years, let's see where we are. That let's leave it open. But yeah, thank you for the lovely conversation and great tips.